the echo chambers in social media that support all of these anti-vax and no to GMO and creationist and homeopathy and flat earth. Every group in the world can find their home without having to challenge their beliefs. And I think that is one of the biggest problems.
The Rational View. The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues. Hello and welcome to The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. On this episode, I'm going to give you a talk that I did to the Canadian Association of Physicists for industrial physicists session, discussing scientific responsibility, as I see it, of scientists and how we should be responsible for communicating our work to the public. And this is also an important time in the podcast because coming up, I'm going to have an interview with Dr. deGrasse Tyson. So stay tuned to the podcast. This is going to be fun. As always, if you enjoy what you're hearing, please press like on your podcast app. Share it with your friends. I'd love to hear your feedback. Come join us on the Facebook discussion group, The Rational View.
So this talk focuses on something a little bit less hard science than our previous talks. So you can maybe relax your calculations and your hard thinking and think more in the soft communications of science, the soft fields, as it were. And I want to focus a little bit on the responsibility of scientists to counter pseudoscientific ideas in society and review some of the factors that have led, in my opinion, to a rise in popular anti-science sentiment in society. I want to provide some insights into how to communicate the ideas of science with the public. And I'm going to give some examples of important environmental issues that are most commonly misconstrued by the general public from my pro-science eco-modernist perspective. So who am I? You've probably all recognized this show. I was actually an unholy hybrid of Raj and Leonard in my graduate work doing laboratory astrophysics. So I wasn't actually going around to telescopes and looking at things. I was in the lab looking at simulated interstellar dust analogs and blowing them up with lasers. So lots of fun. And then I went on to become Howard Wolowitz, unfortunately, building hardware for space. But if you're familiar with comic books and recognize Sheldon's shirt and the logo there, you might know that as Alan Scott, I am actually the original alter ego of Green Lantern. So what do I do for a living? After graduation, I joined the space group at Cal Corporation in Ottawa, developing space-based remote sensing payloads for science instruments. I wanted to stay connected to astronomy and physics, so I joined the Ottawa Royal Astronomical Society of Canada chapter, and I went through as a council member, and eventually I served a term as president. I also ran the telescope loan library for about a decade, where we loan out telescopes to members for a very minimal fee. So the Cal Space Group went on to be purchased by EMS Technologies and then ComDev in, I think, 2005. And now we're owned by Honeywell. So we change our letterhead every 5 or 10 years. And as Denise says, in industry, you get to work with such a broad scope of things. You get this broad scope of, if you're worried about the narrowness of doing a physics PhD, which, it's a breath of fresh air to be able to investigate so many things and learn about so much stuff. And also I was very lucky to get into a field where I can do cool space stuff. So I've worked with atmospheric remote sensing with York University, compact magnetic resonance imagers with University of Winnipeg, and Mars mineral spectroscopy. I've worked with Doppler imaging of atmospheric winds with the University of New Brunswick. I've worked with University of Victoria on Oort cloud asteroid occultation instrument concepts. I've worked with the University of Guelph developing lunar greenhouses to grow plants on the moon. I've worked with Carleton and York on nanophotonics and integrated optics for optical communication systems and spectroscopy. I've worked on lunar instrumentation with Western. I've radiation tested electronics at the high energy proton beams at Triumph in Vancouver. I'm currently the technical lead on the Castor Space Telescope. Here you can see in this picture of some of the cool space stuff. This is a biological instrument on the International Space Station that I worked on, developing a fluorescence imager for a microfluidic chip so that the astronauts can use just a prick of blood instead of taking a whole vial of blood and sending it down and get in situ assessment of the blood chemistry. This is the Sapphire optical payload on Canada's operational defense satellite, looking at other satellites and plotting their courses and sending that data to NORAD to prevent satellite collisions. This is the James Webb Space Telescope fine guidance sensor that I worked on for radiation assessment and radiation tolerance assessment of detectors and things like that. And I'm working on a lot of different future missions. I'm working with Ian on KeySat, which is a quantum key distribution prototype that we're building for the Canadian Space Agency. Castor, as I've mentioned, is a Canadian-led 1 meter class optical and ultraviolet satellite mission, which is being worked on by University of Victoria, led by Pat Cote at Hertzberg Institute. Optical intersatellite communications links, as you see here, is what's paying the bills. Working with Honeywell and developing terminals to help support internet in the sky. This is some of the optical, the integrated optics stuff that I'm doing with the NRC here in Ottawa and Western and University of Toronto and York and Carleton, looking at developing optical phased arrays for satellite laser beam pointing using no mechanisms. And that's a really cool project, lots of fun. Throughout all of this, I've supported the scientific method online and through my social media commentary. I know probably all of you have social media accounts and you see the pseudoscience out there. It's been that part of it's been a bit of a frustrating experience for me, as society seems to be slipping backwards from my youth when, we had the space program and there was, we're going to the moon. We have all of these different rockets, and it looked like we were on this progression to everyone having their own jetpacks. And then things kind of fell apart, or so it seemed. And society started having a bit of a mistrust. And I felt as though that the message is important. I had a responsibility to communicate science. I feel that scientists as a whole have not been winning the war of trust in the public's eye. We're seen as elites in ivory towers and disassociated from the rest of society. And I think this has hurt the profession and it's hurt society. It's partly the fault of scientists for disengaging and not paying attention to the public messages that they put out and not working hard to communicate their work to the public. We've allowed the world to take some giant steps backwards. We didn't speak up strongly enough to defend the safety record of nuclear power. I remember when the disarmament protests were going on for nuclear weapons testing, and that's definitely a laudable goal, and it was great that we stopped airborne nuclear weapons testing. But we threw out the baby with the bathwater when we stopped developing nuclear power. And it seemed difficult to defend nuclear power when we collectively needed to focus on nuclear disarmament. And now, thanks to our silence, we have a climate catastrophe to fix. Our scientific communication strategies in general need work. Why is society disengaging from us? Are we inclusive? Are there vast swaths of society that see us as elitist? Here are some issues you probably recognize: the echo chambers in social media that support all of these anti-vax and no to GMO and creationist and homeopathy and flat earth. And all of these things seem to have found their footing in these little protected echo chambers on the internet and in social media, where the social media gives them clickbait headlines and gives them what they like and doesn't force people to communicate outside of your echo chamber. Every group in the world can find their home without having to challenge their beliefs. And I think that is one of the biggest problems. So are we being inclusive, and why aren't people talking to us? Why aren't people listening to science? Have to mention that we as a group of physicists are not gender representative of society. There's a cult of genius, I think, in a lot of cases that people buy into, that says that brilliance is innate in people's genes. And a lot of people will say that women can't physically think like men. However, I think the data, if you look into it, on success in technical and STEM fields shows that career in a scientific job correlates more with grit and tenacity than with IQ scores or genetics. Adherence to traditional gender roles results in female scientists who want families being sidelined during the productive period of their life that most men are doing postdocs for peanuts and building scientific reputations. And there's a problem there. What proportion of you consider child rearing to be a woman's role? Even visionary science fiction of the future. You look at the Star Trek series, and I was looking back at going over the original Star Trek series because I'm a big fan of Star Trek. They even fall prey to this. And in the episode Who Mourns for Adonis, Kirk and McCoy are talking about a beautiful female officer saying that one day she will find the right man and Kirk will lose an officer. This is a mindset that's still in society and is pervasive. And there's a stigma against men taking time off to raise children. We as a society, I think, need to downplay traditional gender roles and realize that some people will want a family, and we need to build career paths for physicists that can support raising families. We need to identify that the current path of postdocs for peanuts does not support that and turns off a whole portion of potential physicists from getting into academia. So those are the problems. What can we do to get our message through? Scientists are taught to communicate by presenting factual arguments alongside all the appropriate caveats for the scientific literature to appear unbiased. And this is fine for the scientific literature and expected and respected. It's not effective in communicating to the general public. Leaders of pseudoscientist movements are extremely confident and also charismatic. This is what they do for a living. And if you're aware of the Dunning-Kruger effect, this is probably why most of them have a lot of confidence. Scientists, however, when we communicate with the public, tend to show how we might be wrong. And we sound tentative and uncertain if we're communicating with the public. One of the favorite debating tactics that I run into on these pseudoscience groups is nicknamed the Gish Gallop, after Duane Gish, who was a famous creationist. And basically, they would shotgun out a whole bunch of bogus arguments, trying to poke holes in science or in, sow doubt. And a lot of it is based on misunderstandings, whether real or not, about real science. And if you're in a debate with these people and you start scrambling to research all of these points and provide long factual rebuttals of each one, you're going to lose a debate, because the message gets lost. This is a bit of a soundbitey medium. It's better in that sort of a case, when you're facing a Gish Gallop, is to give a blanket statement of BS and ask them to identify their best argument and then dismantle it decisively with facts. Keep your cool. Don't take the bait to become riled, as this is going to alienate the silent majority who are on the fence. Now, many important social issues have become polarized, and the debate quickly usually degrades into a yelling match between isolated extremes who can't even agree on basic facts. Social media encourages these echo chambers, and in these echo chambers, they create their own reality to match their pre-existing biases. And the opponents become idiotic caricatures. psychologists will tell you that when you have someone with an opposing viewpoint, which is held strongly emotionally for some reason, quoting facts and statistics are not effective at changing people's minds. And this is our typical approach. We say, here's the facts, here's the statistics, and people don't care. That makes them, that makes them basically shell up, as turtle up. These are the elites. You can't trust them. What you need to do is find common ground. You can't attack people to get them to listen to you. You need to look for common ground and work outwards from there. These people aren't necessarily idiots. The general public, half the general public aren't idiots. These people don't have the education or the background to investigate scientific literature themselves. So they trust their leaders. It's a form of tribalism. Name calling, flaming, and weaponizing meme posting just increase the polarization. So this isn't just the pseudoscience side of the issue. A lot of pro-science people are in the same camp of tribalism. They've just picked science to be their tribe, and they don't really understand the bases of the arguments that they're using. If you were challenged on a debate, for example, could you provide a coherent scientific argument on the spot supporting the age of the universe? Could you bring evidence? Maybe. What about the safety of genetically modified organisms? No, you can't on the spot bring that up unless, of course, you're very bright and in that field. It's just impossible to know enough to have the facts at your fingertips on all of these things. And with a physics background, we have the ability to research these things quickly, to look over the literature, summarize, look for summaries. We understand how to search the literature, how to read papers, how to bring the facts to the arguments. And I said I would give you some examples. How about the health risks of nuclear power? Could you put together an argument? As physicists, we should understand the basics of a nuclear reactor, how they work. But most people don't know that the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, or UNSCEAR, has reviewed the Chernobyl accident, concluded that basically from the radiation that was released, less than 100 deaths can be attributed to that radiation. That shocks a lot of people. Right now, the radiation in the Chernobyl exclusion zone is down to 3 or 4 microsieverts per day in most places. It's not much different from background levels anywhere else in the world. How much is dangerous, though? No measurable increase in cancer has been shown in humans without having more than, or with less than 100 millisieverts of acute dose, which is from the Hiroshima cohort study. Anyone who got less than 100 millisieverts in that one acute dose, there's no measured increase in cancer risk. So that's 100 millisieverts acute dose. Walking around Chernobyl, you're 3 to 4 microsieverts per day. There's really no evidence for increased cancer from chronic dose, from low dose areas. You can get, tens of millisieverts over a year, and there are no correlatable increases of cancer. Now, it's difficult to track correlations for cancer because it's so common, and small changes due to background radiation are very difficult to tease out from all of the other sources of cancer, from diet, sunlight, and oxygen, for example. Very difficult to tease out. There's a big debate going on right now over whether we should use a linear no threshold theorem for the health effects, which leads to the ALERA principle being applied to nuclear reactors, that as little as reasonably allowable radiation drives the cost of nuclear to be almost unattainable. Yet there's no medical evidence supporting that principle. There's actually a similar amount of evidence showing radiation hormesis, that small amounts of radiation are actually good for you and induce repair mechanisms in your body. So I wouldn't say that's accepted scientific fact, but it's on the same level as the other option. And one of them basically causes climate change if you accept it. So when challenged by someone who spends their life on this stuff and you get out of your depth, the tendency is for any semblance of polite discussion to break down into ad hominem. But how are we going to avoid another Fukushima unless scientists speak out and challenge popular myths that support existing biases? If you're aware of the Fukushima Daiichi reactor meltdown after the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, it was a horrible disaster. Thousands of people were killed in the tsunami and evacuated from their homes. Elderly and the sick were evacuated from their homes due to the meltdown, and many died when they couldn't receive the care they needed due to the lack of infrastructure from the tsunami. And they weren't allowed to go back to their homes for several years. In fact, some of them, several areas still are evacuated. And we know that now, had they stayed put, the radiation levels most likely wouldn't have caused any significant health effects. But 1,600 people died in the evacuation from the fear, from being displaced from their homes and their support networks when they should have stayed. In fact, as a result of Fukushima, Germany made the decision to shut down their nuclear fleet. Japan immediately shut down all of their nuclear fleet. And we know how many deaths resulted from the uptick in fossil fuel burning because of the shutdown of nuclear. And you can see here that it's a very clear signal that thousands of people are dying because we're allowing fossil fuels instead of nuclear. So the pandemic gave me time to reassess my priorities. And as a result, I decided to start speaking out more on these topics and providing an evidence-based perspective to the public. And the way I did that was I started a podcast. And what I wanted to do was to be able to use the tools of science to address important social issues that I thought were being, where there was a lot of misinformation. I read the key papers, and what I did was I put out podcast episodes on a lot of different ideas, on a lot of different things that people are worried about and have, that are, pretty well-known pseudoscience stuff. Try to give people some weapons of science to take with them and to debunk some of these arguments. And some of these are obvious, some are more difficult. I provided scientific counter-arguments for common young Earth creationist talking points, for example, which was kind of fun. I researched the data supporting carcinogenesis from acute radiation exposures. I researched EMF sensitivity. And something interesting happened. I got a pretty big following. And then I also continued. I learned the difference between medical cohort studies and case control studies for assessing the literature. I put out a podcast on glyphosate and the toxicity or lack of toxicity of that and lack of evidence for cancer. And then half my audience disappeared because they had some innate biases. As soon as you counter a cherished belief like Monsanto is the devil, you tend to alienate a lot of folks. I'm not saying Monsanto is squeaky clean, but I'm also not going to just go along with unsupported claims. So during my journey, I've encountered a lot of interesting people. I've discovered that other folks like me who believe we can still achieve a Star Trek future do exist. They call themselves Ecomodernists. As a group, they believe that technology can allow humanity to decouple growth from debilitating environmental effects through abundant low-carbon energy. We need to build a lot of nuclear power in a short time frame, and it can be done. Solar and wind will help with this transition. We need all of our tools. If you look at the scale of the problem of decarbonizing modern society, it is daunting. Solar and wind can't be available 24/7 as baseload to get us to net zero, though. We need to maintain our existing nuclear reactors and build lots of new ones. I'm an optimist. I think it's a nonpartisan, pro-science message that resonates with a lot of people. It provides hope where many have become maybe nihilistic and disengaged. So, in summary, I suggest that if you're interested in communicating science to the public, and I think you should be, find an important issue that you're passionate about and engage respectfully within your community. Join a club. Give talks. Give educational talks at your local library even. Write letters to your local newspaper. Become engaged. For me, the climate is a big one. We as a society, I think, have been seduced by the allure of abundant fossil fuels. And I like to make the analogy, they're like the One Ring in The Lord of the Rings. It's an easy source of power that corrupts the more you use it. And fossil fuels must be resisted. We need to reforge our society on the basis of low carbon power sources. So I charge you all to be my fellowship of the ring and to go forth and help me to cast fossil fuels back into the depths of Mount Doom. If you want to chat more, come and find the Rational View discussion group on Facebook and check out my podcast at Rational View on Podbean. Thank you. If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView. Thanks for listening.